I love this old tree. It's a most unusual tree. It's like a red gum, but it's got different kind of leaves to most red gums have. I haven't been able to identify or establish what it is with any certainty. To me, it's kind of a sacred tree. It's got magnificent hollows in it where I've seen kookaburras nesting, I've seen pardalotes nesting, and it's in beautiful fruit at the moment. They're about to burst into flower. It's a wonderful old tree. And it reminds me of the tree that was regarded as sacred by the people in Abraham's time. It's a very difficult thing to be an immigrant. You come into a country and you've got to work out what you're going to do with the people already there. Throughout history there have been four basic approaches. Firstly, conquer. This is the traditional empire method, the Roman Empire, where they come into the country and they smash it and kill it and destroy it and steal everything they possibly can. Then the second one is colonize. And it's a little bit like the first one, but it's a bit different, where you go into the country and you want to take it over, but you do so a bit more peacefully, but you end up taking as much as you possibly can and integrating the people who are there into your empire. The third one is civilize, where you go set up a base in the new country, and you try and enlighten the ignorant people who live there, bring light into their darkness, because you know all the truth and they don't know anything. And that's been a missionary approach in the past in some cases, which has been very unfortunate. But for most immigrants, when they imagine, there's the immigrant experience, which is the fourth one, and they come into the country, they may come as refugees seeking asylum, or they may come as people looking for a better life. They come into a new society, and when they come, they look at it and they see it with eyes that we don't see if we live there. But the immigrant sees life differently. They see, first of all, they see some things that are bewildering. When an immigrant comes to Australia, they might find, for example, Australian rules football is completely bewildering, and people's passionate love for it. Then they may say some things that they say, oh, this is bad, this is bad. And they might look at Australia, for example, and they might say, look at the way they neglect their elderly and shove them in homes and don't look after them. Or they might see other things which they would regard as part of bad things in our culture. And then they'll see some things that are good. Like in Australia, they might see the way they educate their children is really good, or the way they give their women opportunities equal with the men almost. That's really good, and they might try and adopt those customs. So the problem is that when you first go into a new culture or a new situation, things that you think are bad might just be bewildering. They mightn't be bad at all. You can confuse bewildering and bad sometimes, or bewildering and good for that matter. And sometimes it's good to take a bit of time to work out what's good and what's not. So it says in Genesis 12 that Abraham came into the land of Canaan, where he'd been told to move, and he moved through the land. He's an immigrant. He's got a lot of cattle with him and sheep and goats, and he's got some people with him and some servants, and he's got his nephew Lot and his wife Sarai. And so he comes into the land and he moves through the country, checking it out, and he's got to go cautiously. He sees a peaceful community living there. He sees no reason to get into a fight. He doesn't have to take over anybody's property or anything. He's looking for a place where he can live. And he comes to a place near Shechem called the Oak of Moreh, or the Terebinth of Moreh, or the sacred tree, the Elon Moreh. And in those days, trees were often places of worship. They were set aside as sacred places. So they take a significant old tree like this one I'm standing beside, and they would see it as a place that was a sacred place, a holy place, a place where they could commune with God in some form or other. And they would have a name for their local god, and they might see the god as living in the tree, and all those kinds of things. Abram didn't come down and try and say, you've got it all wrong, let me tell you about the God I know, whose name is Yahweh. He didn't do that. But he recognised this was a good place, and he camped the night there at the sacred tree of Moreh. And the servants all went to bed, and the flocks are all settled down, and Lot and his crew are over there, and Sarai's in the tent, and Abram goes for a walk. And he comes to the sacred tree, and he walks up to it, he touches it, he sits down on a rock beside it, And he thinks, this is a kind of holy place. And then he kind of hears a voice. And God says to him, Abram, look around this land. I'm going to give it to your children. And Abraham jumps up, his eyes are wide, he races into the tent. He says, Sarah, guess what happened? God spoke to me. It's the first time I've heard his voice since he said to leave. And next morning he gets up, and right there beside that sacred tree, which was sacred to the religion of Moray and the people who lived there, he builds an altar and he begins to worship God. I imagine he calls all his household together, and maybe he offers a lamb. Maybe they sing, maybe they dance, but they praise the name of Yahweh, the God who's spoken to him. And the curious locals, they're thinking, that's strange, we've never heard of this God. I wonder what that means. But here was a man in a strange country, in a strange land, setting up an altar to the God that he knew. Interesting story, isn't it? He didn't feel obliged to criticize and condemn the gods of the other people around about him. He let them believe what they believed, but he was true to the God who'd revealed himself to Abram. And so this was a pattern. He moved on down to the oak of Mamre. There's another sacred tree owned by a guy called Mamre, who's a Hittite or an Amorite. And he's got two brothers or cousins that share the chieftain role in the clan. Their names are Eshcol and Aner. At the oak of Mamre, Abram enters into a treaty with the three chieftains of the local tribe, Eshcol, Aner and Mamre. And they have some sort of agreement that they will support each other and work together on things. And when news comes through that some raiders from the desert have come and have ripped into the cities on the plain, and they've actually looted everything and captured many men, women and children, including Abram's nephew Lot, Abram says to the other guys in the treaty, he says, let's go together. Let's form a little troop, and let's go and see if we can rescue these people and get their stuff back. Well, it's a long story. In chapter 14 of Genesis, you can read it. It's a great story, and Abram's completely successful with a small troop. He manages to win the day, and he gets all the stuff back and releases the people. And they're trekking back up the valley and towards the Oak of Mamre, where they come from, I presume. And as they get near Salem, which later becomes Jerusalem, it's probably occupied by the Jebusites at this stage, a man comes out who they say is a local priest, a priest of El Elyon. That's the name of the god El Elyon that he worships. It means the Most High God. It also says he's the king of Salem. So this man is the priest of El Elyon and a king of Salem, which is another name for Jerusalem. His name's Melchizedek. He's quoted in the book of Hebrews and also in Psalm 110. And Melchizedek comes out and says a blessing over Abram in the name of his God, El Elyon. He says, "Blessed be Abram by El Elyon, the Most High God, creator of heaven and earth." And Abraham accepts that from him, and then there's an exchange between them. Melchizedek gives Abram bread and wine, which could be kind of like a sacrament, we don't know, or it could just be refreshment for the journey, they're tired. And then in return, Abram gives him a tenth of all the plunder, all the goods that he's just won in the battle. Sometimes when you've had a great success, you feel like you've made a profit or you've got a tax return or something. I feel like I want to give God thanks. And how do I do it? I often give a tithe. I might give it to the church, or I might give it to a charity. That magpie's going nuts up there, isn't he? Very nice. And this is what Abraham did. He wanted to give a tenth to show how grateful he was that God had rescued him and helped him win the battle. And he gives it to this priest, this local indigenous, you might say Aboriginal holy man called Melchizedek. And then Abraham does something extremely interesting. In a complete masterstroke, in speaking to someone else who's there, he says, "I swear by Yahweh El Elyon, creator of heaven and earth," this solemn oath. Now, I'm not going to talk about the oath that he swears, but how stunning is this? He acknowledges this indigenous priest's god, El Elyon, and identifies it as the same God that he worships, but he has a different name for him. He appends the name for God, Yahweh, to Melchizedek's name for God, El Elyon. He says, I swear by Yahweh El Elyon, creator of heaven and earth, this solemn oath. Now this suggests to me that Abram recognizes that he's not the only one who knows God. He's not the only one who knows that there is one God who created everything. And I think there are many cultures in the world, many religions in the world that acknowledge there is a one creator God who is the most high God who created everything. And Abraham recognized that he didn't have a monopoly on that God, even though he knew him by the name Yahweh, which the others didn't know. Perhaps he's acknowledging that God can have different names. God is already at work in this culture, he's recognizing. And it's not all darkness. So Abram doesn't have to explain to these people that there is a God. They're not atheists. They know there is a God and they've met him and they've given him a name, El Elyon. It's a bit like Paul in Acts when he says, I saw an altar to the unknown God that you were worshipping. I want to tell you the name of that God. And he explains what he knows about God as revealed to him by Jesus Christ. And so Abraham does the same thing. He says, I swear to you by Yahweh El Elyon. He puts the name Yahweh, which is the name that God revealed himself to Abraham by. He puts that in front of Melchizedek's name for God, El Elyon. When I get engaged in discussions with non-Christians, I often find that many are willing and wanting to talk about a God of the universe. I must not dismiss this as the ignorant ramblings. Now, they may not get their information from the Bible, but I take it as a sign that God's been at work in their lives. God has been at work in their community. God's Spirit is revealing something to them outside my experience, outside the church, revealing something of God's self to people who are seeking for him. I don't shy away from the belief, which I hold very firmly, that the true high God has been best revealed to this world by Jesus. But I recognise that it may take people a long journey to find that. But I can discern God working amongst them already. God is already bringing them on that journey, whispering in people's hearts, showing glimpses of divinity, spreading rumours of angels, helping them to see the possibility that there is a God who calls them to account, a God who can forgive their sins, a God who loves them, who wants to know them, wants them to know. Abram lived among people of a different faith without compromising his beliefs or criticising theirs. He continued to openly worship Yahweh his God without embarrassment, without shame, and eventually all God's promises to him were realised. There's something there for us.